Shabbat Shalom. Hag Chanukka Sameach. Happy day, a happy festival. And therefore everything here is nicely decorated. Perhaps it is not so easy to see all of this from the internet, but we have everywhere these lights and it is nice everywhere. And all of this is because we are celebrating Hanukkah. Perhaps it is similar to what is celebrated as for Christmas, but that you don't get mixed up with this. As for us, it is Hanukkah. Today we have the second day of Hanukkah. And in the afternoon we will have a special celebration and a special program. Via internet you can tune in, and it will start at 4 p.m. local time. So come and join us, and we will celebrate together, and we will light the third candle at the end of the Sabbath day. So congratulations for this festival. I was thinking for quite a while, have been thinking for quite a while what to preach about today. Well, not really. It was quite simple. About Hanukkah, what else? As long as our congregation has been existing for 25 years, the 26th is already running. It's quite easy on the days of the festivals, because you know which direction you are going to preach, but at the same time it is also difficult, because every new year you have to find something new. Because among us there might be listeners or those who watch who would remember what has been said 25 years ago, and with the age it's even more easy, because you remember what was 25 years ago. You remember this better than what was yesterday. But this is a different subject. So therefore, Hanukkah. Perhaps it will not be as new what I'm going to say, but nevertheless. I will speak about the events or the incidents of Hanukkah. And I would like to point you what happened at the times of the Maccabees, which was prophesied already from Daniel. For example, Daniel chapter 7. Daniel describes 4 empires or 4 kingdoms that God had showed him. The Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Macedonian Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. God had revealed it to him or showed it to him in a more general way. And in chapter 8, God shows him quite a specific image. This is nothing new for God, first to show the more general vision or view, and then going on to some more details. Do you remember the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshit? In the first chapter, God explains how everything was created, And in the second chapter, he goes into a few of the details. Just a few of the details about creation. And the same way it is with the divine revelation in the prophetic book of Daniel. In chapter 7, he describes the whole picture in general. And in chapter 8, the focus is pointing to certain details. And there he speaks more about the Macedonian Greek Empire. So this is where the focus is shifting to. And in chapter 11, the Lord gives Daniel an even more specific, more detailed picture or prophecy. By pointing our focus to the Emperor Epiphan IV, with whom all the events of Chanukka are connected. And from chapter 7 to chapter 12, the Lord shows Daniel even more. Not just these 4 empires, not just the Macedonian Greek Empire, not just the time of Chanukka, but also what is in a more distant future. He does not show him the more global picture or image, which is connected with the heavenly picture. And when we read chapter 7 to chapter 12 from the book of Daniel, maybe you can get confused by thinking, Daniel, what are you talking about? Or even, God, what do you really mean with that? Which events are in connection with what? He describes the specific event that the temple in the time of Antioch IV will be defiled. And at the same time, he describes the resurrection from the dead. He talks about specific righteous people in the time of Antioch or the Maccabees. And at the same time, he speaks about the righteous in the future who will enter into the kingdom of God. He speaks about a specific evil king, Antiochus. And at the same time, he speaks about the great wrath of the king of the last times. He speaks about the victors in the time of the Maccabees, and he speaks about the Messiah, who is about to come in the future. So how can you not be confused with all of these things? It is not easy to separate one from the other. But at the same time, both is en vogue, or is up to date. Those who read the Bible, you would know the expression, the image of abomination. I don't know the exact what it is in English. Let's have a look at chapter 9 in the book of Daniel. verse 27 of chapter 9. I will read verses 25 to 26. You are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood, even to the end that there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offerings. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. The second temple is described, the return of the Jews, the Messiah, the King, the one who will be cut off, a new covenant which will be established, and the destruction of abomination. Was this at the time of Hanukkah? Not quite. But something similar happened, but not quite. We're going to read about it later. Let's have a look at chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 31. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. Let us have a look at this in its context. When you look at this chapter, you see tortures, torments, or tormenting, and only a few will survive. The righteous will suffer. Many will follow this unjust and unclean king, because they will like what he is telling them, and in the temple there will be erected abominations of desolations. I would like to underline again in the 11th chapter of the book of Daniel, from verse 21 to 45, God shows to Daniel a horrible prince or emperor or regent. And here we recognize Antioch the Fourth and the events of Hanukkah. Once again, this term, abominations of desolation, in chapter 9. It speaks about the future from our perspective. And in chapter 11, it speaks about the time of Chanukka. Let us look at verse 11 in chapter 12, which is, so to say, the end. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Let us look at verse 1 of chapter 12 to see how this chapter begins. Now at that time Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress, such as never occurred since there was a nation, until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. Almost everything is pointing to Chanukka, with a few exceptions, for example, the Book of Life. The first verse points to Chanukka. Let's have a look at verses 2 and 3. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. Those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven, and those who lead the many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. And now, what is this verse talking about? Which kind of abomination of desolation? What kind of difficult time? Who are the victors? Here, for sure, you can be confused. In one chapter, there is Chanukka, which is the 2nd century before our time, and at the same time the eternal future. Now I would like to compare this with another concept, the Messiah. Today we have heard about Messiah, the son of Joseph, the suffering Messiah. At the same time, we know the concept of Messiah, the king, who is the son of David. One exists as well as the other, and they exist together. But how can this work? We read in the Bible, the Messiah, son of Joseph, the suffering Messiah, he is suffering and he dies and reigns after. And about Messiah, the king, Messiah, the son of David, about him we read that he reigns, but in the 12th chapter of Zechariah, in verse 10, it says that he has suffered beforehand and that he was destroyed or killed. So who is it talking about? About the one and the same Messiah who is reigning, but before had suffered and was killed. The one who had suffered and was killed and later was reigning. It is one and the same Messiah, and two different expressions, two repetitions. The first coming of the Messiah was in order to suffer, and the second coming of the Messiah is to reign. So why am I saying this to you? Because we have the same, we can read the same as for Hanukkah. We should have two Hanukkahs, two in one. One concept and two events. How many Passovers do we have in the whole history of Israel? Two. The leaving out of Egypt and what Yeshua did, his sacrifice. Which first fruits do we have in all of the history of Israel? Two. In the same way as we left Egypt, as we went out of Egypt and began to celebrate the feast of unleavened bread, and that Yeshua rose from the dead, how many Shavuot do we have? Two. When the nation of Israel received the Torah at Mount Sinai, and the second time when the believers in Yeshua received the Holy Spirit. And I can continue in the same way with the Rosh Hashanah, with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and as well as Sukkot, Feast of Tabernacles. I cannot say this as for the Sabbath days, because there are so many Sabbath days. Every week we have one. And at the time of the Sabbath, you point towards the future as well as towards the past. A person who prefers to explain everything in a sequence might get confused. So two Passovers, two Chanukkahs. So what is difficult to understand with this? I would like to read you two passages from the first book of the Maccabees, where is described what happened about at the time of Chanukah. And of course I will read it with a certain meaning, because we are going to read something else after that. If you do not exactly recognize what I am reading from, or what I'm reading about. I'm reading from the first book of Maccabees, first chapter, verses 54 to 64, and I'm reading from the King James Version. This book does not exist in many of your Bibles, but this book is in the Catholic Bibles or in the Orthodox Bibles, but not necessarily in the evangelical Bibles. Also, it's not included in the Tanakh. But the Jews, they honor or respect this book as part of our history. And they say that what is described there are historical truths. So now I read. Now, the 15th day of the month Casleu, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and builded idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side, and burned incense at the doors of their houses and in the streets. And when they had rent in pieces the books of the law which they found, they burned them with fire, and whosoever was found with any the book of the testament, or if any committed to the law, the king's commandment was that they should put him to death. Thus they did by their authority unto the Israelites every month, as to as many as were found in the cities. Now the 25th day of the month they did sacrifice upon the idol altar, which was upon the altar of God, at which time according to the commandment they put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised. And they hanged the infants about their necks, and rifled their houses, and slew them that had circumcised them. Howbeit many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat any unclean thing. Wherefore they choose rather to die, that they might not be defiled with meats, and that they might not profane the holy covenant. So then they died.
Ließ König Antiochus das Gräuelbild der Verwüstung auf den Altar Gottes setzen und in allen Städten Judäas Altäre für Götzen errichten, damit man öffentlich auf dem Markt und jeder vor seinem Haus räucherte und opferte. Fand man Bücher des Gesetzes, wurden sie von ihnen zerrissen und verbrannt, und alle, bei denen man Bücher des Bundes fand, und alle, die das Gesetz hielten, wurden nach dem Gebot des Königs totgeschlagen. So ließen sie Monat für Monat ihre Kraft an den Israeliten aus, die sie in den Städten entdeckten. Am 25. Tage des Monats opferten sie auf dem Götzenaltar, der auf dem Altar des Herrn stand. Die Frauen, die ihre Söhne hatten bestechen lassen, wurden getötet, die Antiochus befohlen hatte. Man hängte ihnen die Knäblein an den Hals und tötete die zu ihnen gehörten und die sie beschnitten hatten. Aber viele vom Volk Israel blieben standhaft und wollten nichts Unreines essen und ließen sich lieber töten, als sich durch Speisen unrein zu machen.
Я понимаю, вы не можете следить за этим текстом, из вас не может.
Ich verstehe, dass viele von euch
I understand that many of you could not follow this text, but you have to really listen carefully.
Вторая глава с 27 по 38 стих.
Ich lese jetzt aus dem ersten Buch der Makkaber.
Now I'm reading from the second chapter of the first book of the Maccabees, verses 27 to 38. Listen carefully, like in the previous passage. And Mattathias cried throughout the city with a loud voice, saying, Whosoever is zealous of the law and maintaineth the covenant, let him follow me. So he and his sons fled into the mountains and left all that ever they had in the city. Then many that sought after justice and judgment went down into the wilderness to dwell there, both they and their children and their wives and their cattle, because afflictions increased sore upon them. Now when it was told the king's servant and the host that was at Jerusalem in the city of David, that certain men who had broken the king's commandment were gone down into the secret places in the wilderness, they pursued after them a great number, and having overtaken them, they camped against them, and made war against them on the Sabbath day. And they said unto them, Let that which ye have done hitherto suffice. Come forth and do according to the commandment of the king, and you shall live. But they said, We will not come forth, neither will we do the king's commandment, to profane the Sabbath day. So then they gave them the battle with all speed. Howbeit they answered them not, neither cast they a stone at them, nor stopped the places where they lay hid, but said, Let us die all in our innocency. Heaven and earth will testify for us, that ye put us to death wrongfully. So they rose up against them in battle on the Sabbath, and they slew them with their wives and children and their cattle, to the number of 1,000 people.
Zogen viele eilends hinter ihnen her und machten sich bereit, sie am Shabbat zu überfallen. Und sie sagten zu ihnen, nun ist's genug, kommt heraus und tut, was der König befohlen hat, so werdet ihr am Leben bleiben. Darauf antworteten sie, wir werden nicht herauskommen, auch wollen wir den Shabbat nicht entheiligen, wie der König befiehlt. Da stürmten die Feinde gegen sie an, sie aber wehrten sich nicht, schleuderten keinen Stein und verschlossen auch die Höhlen nicht und sagten, wir alle wollen lieber schuldlos sterben. Himmel und Erde werden Zeuge sein, dass ihr uns mit Gewalt und Unrecht umbringt. So wurden sie am Shabbat überfallen und sie und ihre Frauen und Kinder samt dem Vieh umgebracht, an die 1.000 Personen.
According to
Евреи
this,
решили защищаться в субботу.
haben die Juden beschlossen, sich am Schabbat, am Samstag zu verteidigen.
Лидеры этого восстания
after this, the Jews decided to defend themselves on a Sabbath day.
Haben beschlossen, sich zu widersetzen.
The leaders decided to resist and not to let these things happen again. A few people from the resistance
Die sich an die Gerechtigkeit Gottes gehalten haben.
who kept the righteousness of God, they increased and they conquered the army of the enemy with great miracles
Indem sie diesen Slogan, dieses Motto befolgt haben.
by following this theme, this subject.
Wer für das Gesetz eifern und den
Who
Bund
is zealous for the law and he who wants to keep the covenant, come with us.
der Tempel verunreinigt wurde,
And 3 years after the temple was desecrated and this abomination of desolation was erected, the temple was delivered, was sanctified again, and the menorah was lit
am gleichen Tag.
at the same time. On the 25th day of the month of Kislev.
Erinnert ihr euch an die
Do you remember the story of Israel, of what happened at the same day?
wollte an Puri, die
Haman wanted to destroy the Jews on the day of Purim, and he determined one day,
wurden den Feinden
and at the very same day the enemies of the Israelites were conquered. The end of the enemies of Israel had come. This resistance terminated with a victory. God was the victor, and the nation of Israel remained alive, and the righteous were shining like the stars.
Das war das erste Chanukka.
This was the first Hanukkah.
Lasst uns das Matthäus-Evangelium im 24. Kapitel aufschlagen.
Let us open the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24.
24 глава Евангелия от Матфея начинается следующими словами.
Das Matthäus-Evangelium
The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24, begins with the following words. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him.
vom Tempel hinweg. Und seine Jünger kamen herzu, ihm die Gebäude des Tempels zu zeigen.
Смотри, какая красота!
Schau, was für eine Schönheit.
Look, what a beauty!
Смотри, какой он построил, как он этот храм украсил и как он его достроил.
Hierot, schau, wie dieser Tempel beschmückt
Here, see how this temple was decorated. And in the second verse he says, and he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down.
Ich sage euch, hier wird kein Stein auf dem anderen bleiben, der nicht abgebrochen wird.
Идут большие перемены. Грядут большие перемены.
Große Veränderungen sind auf dem Weg.
Big changes are on their way. Verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciple came to him privately, saying, tell us when these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming, and of the end of the age.
Zu ihm und sprachen, sage uns, wann wird dies geschehen und was wird das Zeichen deiner Wiederkunft und des Endes der Weltzeit sein?
На вопрос, когда, он решил не отвечать.
Auf die Frage nach dem Wann,
As for the question, when, he decided not to answer. But as for the question how and what kind of signs there will be, he did answer.
Он цитирует очень много из пророков из еврейской истории.
in seinen Antworten
And in his answers, he quotes many of the prophets and events in Jewish history.
Если мы посмотрим в эту главу,
aber wenn wir dieses Kapitel
But when we look
с
at this chapter,
9 стиха,
vom 9. Vers an.
beginning from verse 9,
и давайте почитаем до 21 стиха.
Lasst uns bis zum 21.
let
Vers
us
lesen.
read up to verse 21, 9 to 21. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whosoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as had not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short.
Und es werden viele falsche Propheten auftreten und werden viele verführen. Und weil die Gesetzlosigkeit überhand nimmt, wird die Liebe in vielen erkalten. Wer aber ausharrt bis ans Ende, der wird gerettet werden. Und dieses Evangelium vom Reich wird in der ganzen Welt verkündigt werden, zum Zeugnis für alle Heidenvölker. Und dann wird das Ende kommen. Wenn ihr nun den Gräuel der Verwüstung, von dem durch den Propheten Daniel geredet wurde, an heiliger Stätte stehen seht, wer es liest, der achte darauf, dann fliehe auf die Berge, wer in Judäa ist. Wer auf dem Dach ist, der steige nicht hinan, um etwas aus seinem Haus zu holen. Und wer auf dem Feld ist, der kehre nicht zurück, um seine Kleider zu holen. Wehe aber den Schwangeren und den Stillenden in jenen Tagen. Bittet aber, dass eure Flucht nicht im Winter noch am Schabbat geschieht. Denn dann wird eine große Drangsal sein, wie von Anfang der Welt an bis jetzt keine gewesen ist und auch keine mehr kommen wird. Und wenn jene Tage nicht verkürzt würden, so würde kein Fleisch gerettet werden. Aber um der Auserwählten willen sollen jene Tage verkürzt werden. Seht ihr Parallelen zu Chanukka?
Do you see the parallels with Hanukkah?
Das vom 14. Vers an.
Look at verse 14. Verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, the abomination of desolation is the idol in the temple. This is what was erected at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. This was at that time a statue of the goddess, the god Zeus. This is one of the important parallels. Daniel spoke about the time that happened at the time of the Maccabeans, but not only, but also of the end times, about what was still to happen. Continue to have a look in verse 16. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Today we read that the resistance fighters did start to do that. They did that. They moved, they went into the mountains. And those who heard Yeshua at that time, they hear these words, they say, we know that. It sounds familiar. This is Hanukkah. Yes. But the future Hanukkah, verse 17, whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak in verse 18. This is what the resistance fighters did at their times. They heard about the abomination of desolation, moved to the mountains. Who is for the Lord follows me. They did not return into the house in order to take something. This is Chanukka. In verse 19, but woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Read the story of Chanukka. You will find that written there. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. Verse 20. When is Chanukka? In winter time. These are difficult times. We don't know exactly when this is going to happen, but it is better if it would not happen in winter. In verse 20 it says, nor on a Sabbath. Why? Because it is Chanukka. This is Chanukka. We read about this today. On the Sabbath, the resistance fighters, they had many problems, or quite some trouble. In verse 21 we continue, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as had not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. In the story of Chanukka, exactly these words are contained. In the books of the Maccabeans, it's written like this, word by word. But Yeshua does not speak about the past, but of the future. In this way, when we celebrate Chanukka, we don't just look into the past, but as well we look into the future, to that which is waiting for us. Yes, there will be these abominations, there will be problems. The righteous will have a difficult time. Yes, many will have to suffer for their righteousness, but the end will come and the victory will come. And then, as it is said, when we continue with chapter 24 in Matthew, reading verse 27, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And the last verse from this chapter, which is verse 30, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. This verse is similar to verse 10 from the book of Zechariah, chapter 12, but not only this one. This verse puts an end to the Chanukka circle as well, from the Chanukka that once was, to the Chanukka pointing to the future. Let's open again the book of the prophet Daniel, and it will be the last passage we are going to read, because this will terminate the circle or close the circle. Daniel chapter 7,
steht in Daniel,
from the prophet of Daniel, verses 13 and 14.
als Daniel die 4 Imperien gesehen
When Daniel saw these 4 empires,
hatte er noch eine Vision.
he had another vision. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one, like a son of man, was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed.
Die Wolken des Himmels, gleich einem Sohn des Menschen, und er gelangte bis zu den Hochbetagten und wurde vor ihn gebracht. Und ihm wurde Herrschaft, Ehre und Königtum verliehen, und alle Völker, Stämme und Sprachen dienten ihm. Seine Herrschaft ist eine ewige Herrschaft, die nicht vergeht, und sein Königtum wird nie zu Ende gehen.
Узнали Матфея 24 главу?
Habt ihr Matthäus 24. Kapitel wiedererkannt?
Did you recognize Matthew chapter 24, the Son of Man on clouds?
Chanukka damals
Chanukka at that time
deutet auf das hin, was
points
sein wird.
to what will be in the future.
Wir müssen uns an unseren Glauben halten.
We have to keep our faith.
Feststehen.
We have to stand firm.
Достигнуто героизмом и праведностью наших предков.
Der Sieg der
The victory of Hanukkah was taken because of the heroic acts and the righteousness of our ancestors.
Wir wollen ihm ähnlich sein.
We want to be similar. We want to be like them, who is for the Lord,
Folge Jeschua.
Грядет к нам
ought to follow Yeshua.
на облаках.
He will come again on the clouds.
Ханука четко и ясно показывает.
Das ist das, worauf
This is what Hanukkah clearly points to.
Счастливой и радостной Хануки.
ein fröhliches und glückliches
A
Hanukkah.
happy and wonderful Hanukkah for you.